All right, welcome back to the Ottawa studios of Inside My Canoe Head. I am your host, Dr. D. Today, we are going to talk about the birth and evolution of the Dependasaurus. So sit back, grab yourself your favorite beverage. Let's get at her. All right, welcome back, and thanks again for everybody who continues to drop wonderful information over at www.insidemycanoehead.ca. We appreciate your feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. Keep it coming. It's how we keep this podcast growing, and it's how we keep feeding you really interesting, cool stuff, which is why today I think it's really awesome that we're going to have an opportunity to talk about the Dependasaurus. What is a Dependasaurus? It is the evolution of the common human today in Western society who believes they're entitled to a slice of the pie from the government, that every single bump in the night has to lead to some new government program or intervention, and whenever something goes astride or awry in your life, then obviously you are owed a solution and amelioration from the public purse. If that describes you, my friend, fill the definition of a Dependasaurus. Somebody who has made the conscious decision that they are no longer capable of or responsible for making sure they have great positive outcomes. I know that's a bit controversial. I wrote a great piece this morning on Substack. Jump over there and follow me at Jeff Donaldson. It's basically the argument in the written form. And this is what we're going to talk about today. Really going from the neanderthals all the way today to understand the bigger title, which is why have we transformed from a society that now calls for and requires the intervention of some benevolent government to address every issue that happens, when that didn't occur for the exceptional vast majority. I know it's horrible English. I apologize to all of my professors. To human history, that's never been the case. So why is that the case now? And if we understand why humanity has transformed from a tribal organization well defined by the 1992 article by a British anthropological professor, Dunbar, and he's coined the phrase Dunbar's number. And there's a number of different Dunbar numbers depending on the size, but that the maximum number of acquaintances a human would collectively have based upon the size and the extent of the operation of the neocortex in the brain is about 150. And what Dunbar posited is he went and did a comparative analysis of the size of the neocortex, which is an active part of your brain. And basically he suggested, and he compared it to all the other primates that have a somewhat reasonable relationship with us without diving into the evolutionary or creationary idea that gets people fighting. The idea being is other primates that very much have the same type of characteristics as us. Humanity has a much higher, the highest level of neocortex activity, but it really expands in his research, or extends only to about 150. Now, you go down to about 5 people in the family. You go to 12. Dunbar also has a number of 12 to 15 people of your really close relationships. 150 of acquaintances, really from an organizational sense. A clan, which would be considered like your community of where you live or whatever, of about 400 to 500. And then the maximum Dunbar number is your tribe, which is 2,000. According to his research, which has been amplified by a number of researchers since then, really above 2,000 people, humans don't have the ability naturally to connect as having any type of relationship, sense of belonging, or responsibility to something bigger than 2,000 people. Now, you have to admit that this seems a little strange, because in how we live now in most modern nations are approaching 80 or slightly over 80% urbanized. I live in a city of 1 million people, right? So Dunbar's argument from an anthropological perspective and it's been backed up by some research, and I'm just reading into this now, so I'm not an expert in this side of the research on the psychological side, is that while you say you're from Texas and you love Texas, the reality is you're actually tied to a smaller geographically, temporally, or culturally defined area that probably is limited to about 2,000 people, right? So I say, I'm Canadian. Great. There's 41 million people here. I don't really associate with the people. I may see the idea, but in essence, I probably have a strong sense of belonging to a community that's about 2,000 people. Now, community is loosely defined. It's fluid, to use a much maligned term in the modern sense. What we're talking about is, community can be geographically delineated, which means an actual neighborhood association or a neighborhood set of boundaries. It can be temporally. So for a period of time, I have a strong sense of belonging to this community group, but that evolves and changes over time as I move and transit around the world. Or it can be culturally or faith defined, right? So for example, if I have a strong Christian faith or a strong Islamic faith, I see myself tied to that much more than I do anything else. So the essence of the theory is that if we draw humanity back to the Neanderthal times and we move forward, Neanderthals and the different levels of humans that fought out to Homo sapiens eventually winning out through a history none of us really know or understand. Basically, there were earthquakes, right? There were tsunamis. There were collective events that impacted significantly and destroyed livelihoods and destroyed society, right? What happened in those times is because really right up until the age of sail, and I'm going to be brutally honest about this, I'm not a historian much before 1400. You think about there were Roman times, there were a lot of organized societies that existed, but they existed in isolation to each other than ones that they could periodically run into over land borders and armies marching and that type of fighting. And then it was really a fight. It wasn't really an interactive, larger collective sense, right? We as a species have dominated, conquered, and taken territory. We do it today in the 21st century. We did it 100 centuries ago, and we'll do it for the next 100 centuries. We will simply conquer land that we want. We will take it from people, and they can whine and cry about the fact they don't have it anymore, but humanity's done this for hundreds of years. We simply take land, we rename it, we call it ours, and it's done deal. Unless you're going to rise up and take it back, that crap is over, my friends. But the point being here is that really with the age of sail, we started to see the interaction of societies. We started to see political and economic interaction between larger global societies. We started to trade with each other. We started to build economic. We started to explore and expand what is colloquially referred to as colonialism, where, again, we just took territory and made it ours. And people have been doing that for tens of thousands of years. It's nothing new and continue for thousands of years. But the point being is we started to create these international political and economic interactions, right? But if we get back to the functioning of a society, when we think about right up until the 1940s, really the last reorganization of the world. As a quick relational sidebar to this, people have, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, you hear me referring to this on a fairly regular basis about the fact that Ray Dalio, Peter Zion, Ian Bremner, and a whole bunch of other really notable thinkers of today's age have really looked back to the age of sail at about 1400 and moved forward and said, hey, listen, about every 70 or 80 years, humanity reorganizes on a global perspective. That means countries jockey, reposition, the global order changes, superpowers emerge, superpowers go away, people make new alliances, we refocus globally, focus locally, whatever it may be. It's been a shifting pattern, but it's almost happened exactly every 70 to 80 years since 1400. Our last modern reorganization was the 1940s, was World War II. And the Bretton Woods agreements that it came out of World War II basically set the conditions for how the world would be run and organized from 1940s onwards. the 2020s represent the next decade. So this decade we're in, as disruptive and crazy as it is humanity's next reorganizational milestone, right? It happens after generations who actively participated in the last one have gone, the records have died off, their voices are not heard anymore, and we go back and repeat a bunch of the same dumb mistakes. But basically, the 2020s is a very deliberate intent to reorganize global society. And this is nothing new. It was very much expected. The pandemic wasn't, obviously, but the disruptive of the 2020s, the wars, the Ukrainian intervention, the potential taking of Taiwan, the end of globalization, the reshoring of factories, all the things that you see going on right now were very much expected, very much predicted, but it is a very chaotic decade that we're experiencing. So you have to frame it in that, because if we begin to look at what changed in society, we have to start from the last global reorganization, right? So when we look at the last global reorganization in the 1940s, when we look at how society emerged post then, some of the great seminal work, if you've ever have an opportunity to read Dr. Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, it's a longitudinal set of studies that were done about Americans' involvement in collectivism. And what I mean by collectivism is memberships in groups. In the 1940s and the early 1950s, Americans as a community and as a society were always involved in collective community events. They would gather together, they would support, they were focused locally on their own tribal, you could call it Dunbar system, in their community, and they were members of bowling clubs, right? Hence the title. And over the 10 or 15 or 20 years involved in some of Dr. Putnam's longitudinal studies, started to emerge to show that there was a deliberate and measurable reduction in the community level involvement of citizens. We as a society were moving away from focusing on local to focusing on national and external. Some researchers have posited, and I don't know whether it's convincing yet, but it's some really interesting work, and they've posited on the idea that in the 1950s and 60s, especially with the Vietnam War, we started to see real-time external events in our face, in our living room, in the nightly news, in the evening news, in the afternoon news. And as the radio and television medium more and more penetrated the American family started paying more and more attention to the external world than their local world. They spent more time discussing and debating international issues. And we see this again when you look at politics. If you look at over time, the amount of time and effort in papers, and I haven't done this, but there's a couple of individuals who have looked at the volume of focus work in newspapers from the 1940s onward, and along with what Dr. Putnam comes through in Bowling Alone, you start to see less and less local focus in news and happenings. News, local focus used to be the A1 or the B1, if you understood what that means. And it started to moving to C2, C4, D5, which are the different sections of a newspaper. It basically means that it went off the front page. And as we moved to television, it's the same thing. We started to see a separation of global and national news from local news. The local news was always late at night, right? Way in the deep dark when everybody who had a job and worked for a living was probably asleep, but the primetime news was being taken over by national issues. And so over a period of decades, what we have seen in society is the evolution of focus external to the community. Now, I argue in my piece that I wrote on Substack is correlated to that is your duty and responsibility of care to those around you. When our focus was on the local community, right? You had a duty of care to ensure that your neighbors and the people around you in your local community had what they needed. So as a community, we fed those who were hungry. When somebody's shelter needed repair or rebuilding after a fire, the community came out. It wasn't an insurance call. There wasn't a program that, wasn't a builder that came out. The community came out and rebuilt the house for the local member. All of these things, we collectively pooled our disposable income as a community to hire a local doctor to service our local community. So the doctor was employed by the community to provide a service to the community. All of our focus was local. As we start to move away from our focus from local to external, our duty of care went away. Right now, you could argue that the most successful, but the only remaining social program derived from the community is the local food bank, right? I live here in Ottawa. I donate to my local food bank to feed my community, the members of my community that are hungry. I give food and disposable income to the food bank so that my people, my tribe here in my neighborhood are fed. I'm not worried about people on the other side of the country, whether they can eat. That by default should be the responsibility of their community to feed them and to address community issues. This is how communities used to work. The reason that that extends is that if you follow Dunbar's research and you extend back to 2000, past the 2000 number, you become involved and focused on something greater than your community. But because it exceeds that Dunbar's number or your tribal sense, you no longer have a sense of responsibility and duty of care to take care of that, right? So now what we have is an emergence of the desire for intervention. When we no longer have a duty to care to our community, when we no longer see a duty of responsibility to take care of those around us, we start to believe that there is something that needs to be in that vacuum. And what we've turned into over time, it's been a slow methodological change in our culture to now we see the government as a benevolent force. We've now transferred that responsibility from community to the government as being, as I like to say, every time there's a bump in the night, you hear a call for a new government program. And so as we've done that, the necessary level of government has gone up. It has ballooned in size. And because it has ballooned in size, and because we're demanding that the government do all of these things for us, which we used to do for ourselves, the amount of money that the government needs, not because they're bad or evil, but because when you ask somebody to do an amazing amount of things for you, you have to give them an amazing amount of money to deliver that type of things. So now we're in a program. Now we've reached what I'm referring to as a decision point. We've got to the point where we're so demanding of the government to do absolutely everything for us and solve every problem in our lives, but we've given them every single dollar that we have available to give, and now the system is at a decision point. Do we allow the government to erode? Do we take over? Do we take back personal responsibility for our outcomes? and community and sense of belonging in the community? Do we do that, or do we continue to figure out a way to go forward? But what my article argues is that we've created a creature called the Dependasaurus. The Dependasaurus is somebody who has the belief that the government owes them something, that they are entitled to a piece of the pie, and that when something goes wrong in their life, they believe they have a right to be ameliorated by the collective government. In other words, think of the response and what happened in the pandemic. How many people called for the government, not the community, to intervene? how many people called or were needing the government to step in and take care of them in times of an emergency or disruption. There is no personal responsibility there. Very few people were following Dave Ramsey and had months and months and months of emergency fund to take care of. People were living their life at the edge. And I'm going to argue a lot of them were doing that because they held an innate belief in the responsibility of government to solve their problems for them and the responsibility of government to take care of them. They, by default and probably not intentionally, have transformed over time into themselves being a Dependasaurus. If government revenue checks in people's bank accounts went away today, would you be able to continue living the life that you're living now? If the answer is no, then you have become a Dependasaurus simply because that's what you've chosen to do. You've chosen to live a life that requires the monetary intervention of the government, not the community, not community support programs, and a lot of what the government delivers short of cash in your bank, and even for some periods of cash in the bank, is simply a modern construction of what the community used to do for you, right? And I'll go back to some of the early examples of Little House on the Prairie. One of my favorite shows growing up, when you looked what happened when a house burned down. Who showed up? All of the local men, now this is gender specific, and the women showed up to whatever, you can get into it if you want to. But the community showed up to rebuild that house. There weren't invoices for my time. I didn't charge you my hourly rate as a carpenter. Yes, I still had to do my job that I was paid to do so that I could provide for my own family. But in the other times of day, I immediately went to you as my fellow community member and offered my assistance free of charge, offered my skills free of charge to ameliorate the situation that you were facing. Now, that could be to feed you, to house you, to water you, to help contribute to get the doctor to you, whatever it may require. Back in those days, back in the days where a sense of community was paramount, we stayed within Dunbar's number and within that greater clan of 2,000 people, which was a pretty sizable town for most of humanity. That town basically took care of its own needs. If people were hungry, they were fed. If shelter was needed, that shelter was provided. If healthcare was needed, it was provided within the community. And what the governance looked for was external, right? And this is where we've lost our sense of local. And my argument in the article, my argument in this podcast is, this is not an intentional, we're not weak. It's not that saying where great times create weak men or anything like that. I'm saying if we understand and can trace how society has moved from the idea of local personal duty of care and responsibility to your community and those around you as part of your collective need for survival, and we transform that since the 1940s into the 2020s, where we have a sense of dependency, a Dependasaurus, as much as I think that's an incredible phrase. Some people will find that offensive, and I'm actually quite happy about that, because when people are offended, they speak up, and when they speak up, we can have great discourse. When you look at the existence of the Dependasaurus that didn't exist 70 years ago, and you can see the correlated size of increase of government involvement in individual lives, and now that we've pushed that existence, I'm going to argue, to the very extreme of what it can do, we're now in a position where we can no longer sustain the benevolent government. What are we going to do next? And I think this is a great conversation that should come up in an upcoming episode. Hey, a quick break in the episode. We provide free preparedness and risk education across social media. If you're looking to up your game, learning to identify the risks that you and your family are exposed to, and develop a strategy to mitigate that risk, being prepared for whatever the world throws at you, drop by our website, www.preparednesslabs.ca. We've gathered the best knowledge from over 100 years of research into exactly what led to the best post-event outcomes and how people thrive in chaos. Now back to the show. And much of that question is, what do we do now, right? What do we do now as a society? How do we go forward? Much of the research that I'm doing in my professional work and in my involvement in the community, my local community and the broader community of research advocates, is I'm really trying to figure out ways to reorientate you and I towards the community. We know that the local level of government is the most important and the most impactful in our lives. We interact them with daily, and they have the greatest influence on our regular, consistent events that happen. And all disasters are local, to use the preparedness frame for this podcast. All disasters are local, and all disasters in the short, medium, and long term are always going to be addressed by your local government and your local community, right? It's the most impactful. But if we look at the amount of attention that is drawn by national level politics right now, especially since the election of Trump, the collapse and failure of the Canadian government as we await the anointing of the next whatever. I'm not going to go down that road, but Canada has a failed government. America just got a totally different government. And many people around the world are trying to figure out what this all means for the broader thing. But we are fixated as a people on what's going on at the national level. We largely ignore the state or provincial level, except when it pops up periodically. But we really don't pay attention to our local government. We see this in voting patterns. Sometimes you get as low as under 30% voter turnout for our municipal councillors, for our mayor, for those elections that put the people in place who have the most impact in our lives, we pay the least attention to. I'm going to argue with you right now, the most important politician who can impact your life is your local city councilor or your county reeve. It's that simple. It gets no more importance than your local level. So when I look at my research, I'm like, I can ramble on about this forever, but how do we generate the conversation that gets you and I to pay less attention to national politics and more attention to local politics? We should be spending far less time worried about what's going on all around the world and trying to alleviate major global problems when we can't take care of our own in our own neighborhood. We need to reorientate ourselves back to our Dunbar number tribe. And this is my argument for today's podcast. This is my argument for my Substack article that I put out and one that I republished on LinkedIn. If you follow me over there, Jeff Donaldson, PhD, you can find me on LinkedIn. And I'm trying to argue that we need to move that needle back. Part of our reorganization of humanity in the 2020s, which again is a regular and expected thing, hopefully what I hope emerges in 2030 as we set the stage for the next 70, 80 years of global organization, is that we get to a point where individuals see the value in local as being more important than external. You know, events all around the world, who cares? Really, in the grand scheme of things, who cares? I'm worried about how I can do what I can to contribute to the health, welfare, and success of my clan, my Dunbar's number tribe. That's where I think we collectively as a society begin to excel. When we take our efforts and we look inwards, we look at our association. And I'll give a prime example. I've talked about it for a while, but never done it. And now I've said, you know what? I've been offered by the community, my local community association, which represents 1,200 households and about 3,400 humans, to give a presentation on emergency preparedness. So I'm doing that next month. I'm going to stand up. I'm going to talk about a lot of the things that I talk about on this podcast, about the need for personal responsibility, the belonging, and what I'm also going to offer to do is be that champion in my neighborhood. Be that individual who says, okay, we need to adopt a culture of preparedness in our neighborhood. We need to adopt our own responsibility for each other. And I'm volunteering to be the guy to help organize this segment of it in my skill set. Because if you remember what I talked about at the very beginning of the podcast, society was successful because each individual had a different set of skills that they brought to the community. And that skill was amplified by the help, assistance, and resources of everybody else around them, right? I have a certain set of skills in preparedness education. I'm bringing that to my community free of charge. And if that's amplified through gatherings, etc., then I can get the message out. And I, through absolutely free work, can invest in building a stronger community around me. That should be my focus, not focusing on what's going on in a foreign country or what's going on in a UN operation somewhere or anywhere else. No, have a great day. My focus should be on this. Now, caveat, I am the secretary on the board of directors for the International Social Capital Association, right? And I also chair the special interest group on disaster resilience, where I focus on building the academic body of knowledge related to the strength of communities. So I'm growing the power of community through being involved in an international group of scholars who talk and think about the power of human relationships to make a difference at local community levels, right? So we talk internationally as how we can bring our knowledge and our experience and our research together to influence and educate in our local communities so that we can continue to build the strength in our local Dunbar number clans. My argument to you today is that's where our focus should be. But there's a very clear road, if you understand it, as where we've gone from community-oriented and community strength society in the 1940s and early 50s to what we have now is a community, a collective of independent, individual Dependasaurus who are demanding a slice of entitled pie out of the government. That is a complete, utter transformation in our society. I'm here to argue it's not for the good, but I'm also here to argue that we can make a change and we can move that needle in the correct direction. I hope you found today's conversation useful. I hope you follow us here at InsideMyCanoehead.ca. We're available on all platforms. Drop over to Substack and follow me at Jeff Donaldson, and then look over at LinkedIn and all other social medias. We are here to help you by providing non-apocalyptic, evidence-based preparedness education for rational people. We help people identify the risk they're exposed to codify that risk, to measure that risk, and then to identify high-risk things that need a strategy to address. That's what preparedness is. It is the identification of risk that you face and then building a strategy to mitigate it. Because you can't get risk to zero. You cannot prevent anything from happening. But what you can do is dramatically and significantly reduce the impact that an external event has on you and your family, which then facilitates your ability to chase your dreams and rock an incredible life. Take care, stay safe, and we'll see you next time.